So up till now, we've learned a lot. We've learned about variables, we've learned about operators, expressions, we've learned about methods, classes, and objects. But how do all of these tie together? When you're writing a program, when you're creating an application, how do all of these things tie together? Let's discuss that at a very high level in this video. What we will try to do is visualize everything we've learned and see how they relate to each other. So at first, we learned about variables, right? We could have a lot of different types of variables. We could have integers, strings, booleans, classes, arrays, and we could have many other types. We also learn about operators, and there could be many different types of operators as well. And so these formed the very basic components of an expression. We would use different variables and we would use operators with those variables to create different expressions. Of course, you can create many different types of expressions using things other than operators and variables. But the idea here is to understand that expressions can be broken down into smaller components. So ultimately, when we have these components, for example, variables and operators, we can create expressions. And each expression is a statement in Java, right? So let's say we represent variables with these triangles and operators with these circles. Then using these variables and operators, you can create expressions which give us a certain result. Right? And then we can combine a lot of these expressions together to create methods. And so let's say we have a lot of these expressions together that do certain operations to give us a final result. And we can actually create a method out of them, right? And inside methods, you can have many different types of expressions. You might have for loops, you might have if-else conditions, you might have general expressions such as these, but ultimately you return a value. And this usually is the final result of all of these expressions doing something or calculating something and ultimately returning a value. Now this return can be anything. It can be some value, it can be an array, it can be any kind of object. You can use this result in another method, or you might even want to use this to interact with some other object from another class, or you might just return this to the user as a final result. There can be many different scenarios. But ultimately, what we learned is that we can use all of these components to create a class. So we have some variables in our classes, and we also have methods in these classes. Usually the first one is always the constructor. So we use variables and operators and then create expressions, which then create methods. And then we use a combination of all of them to create classes. And from the class, we create instances of the class. And these are basically our objects. So Java is an object-oriented programming language, right? Which means that whenever you're creating an application, a software, or a program, you usually create a lot of objects. And those objects interact with each other to give you the results that you want. So in an application, you'll have a lot of these classes, and from these classes, you have even more objects. There can be any number of objects that you can create from the different classes that you have, and those objects will then interact with each other in whatever ways that is necessary for the program to run. And based on all those interactions, you'll have results that you can then output as a result of your program. So you see, it's all about creating the objects that ultimately would interact with each other and give us the results that we need. Which means that we are basically in the business of designing classes, because the objects that we create them from classes, right? Now, most of our code will write in creating these classes, and that is true for any program. So we need to make sure that our classes are well designed. So for example, if you're creating an alarm application that will allow users to set alarms on their phones, you might want to create different classes. So we might have a clock class, we might also have an alarm sound class, we might have an alarm time class, and we may even have a calendar class because users can set their alarms on any date in the calendar. So then when a user creates an alarm, we create an alarm time object. The user can also set the sound of that alarm. So in that case, we might use the alarm sound object. The alarm time would be based on the times that we can get from clock objects, and then the users can also set alarms based on a calendar date, and that might be a calendar date object. And based on the interactions of all those objects, we will have a program output, and the program output would typically be the alarm sound, and it would occur based on the time that the user sets. So this is a very simple example of a program, and we're not going into too much detail here, but the concept that I want you guys to understand is that whenever you're creating an application or whenever you're writing code, you're basically thinking of creating objects that will interact with each other to give us any kind of result. And in order to create those objects, we need to create a lot of different classes. And so ultimately, it all comes down to designing good classes, because most of our code would be written there. In order to design good classes and design them in a way where we do not have to repeat and rewrite a lot of our code, we take advantage of a few object-oriented concepts. Concepts like inheritance, polymorphism, and abstraction. In this chapter, we will be talking about inheritance and polymorphism. Remember that these are concepts that allow us to design classes in a better way. And then once we have created our classes, we can then create objects from them in any way we need. So keep in mind that most of this has to do with how we design our classes and how we use these concepts to make our designs better. Also, keep in mind that encapsulation is a part of object-oriented design. So great, now let's start learning about inheritance.